The night sky above Earth was darker than usual. The stars flickered like 1,000 distant eyes, watching the world below. On the outskirts of a small town, near a hidden forest, Clyra, a member of the cold and logical alien race known as the Psychtar, stood in silence, her gaze fixed on the planet below. Her mission was simple: observe, gather information, and return to her people. But from the moment she set foot on Earth, something shifted within her. The emotions humans radiated, their warmth, their connections, they were all so intense, so alive, unlike anything she had ever known. As Clyra moved through the shadows, her sleek black suit blending with the night, she felt an irresistible pull. It wasn't from her mission. It was something else, something deeper. She had been trained to resist such urges, but tonight was different. Tonight, Earth was calling to her in ways she never expected. It was then she saw him, Julian Hale. He was leaning against his car, staring up at the stars, as if he were waiting for something. Clyra's heart skipped a beat. She had never encountered a human like him. His presence was magnetic, like the pull of the moon on the ocean tides. His energy was warm, vibrant, and far more captivating than anything she had read about in her mission reports. Julian had no idea that something, was watching him. He had always been a curious man, one who preferred quiet nights under the stars, letting his thoughts wander as he searched for a deeper meaning to life. But tonight, his solitude was disturbed by an odd sensation, a feeling that he wasn't alone. As he turned toward the tree line, his breath caught in his throat. For a brief moment, a figure stepped out from the shadows. A woman. Her silhouette was stunning, her movements so graceful that she seemed to glide rather than walk. Clyra didn't need to make a sound. Her presence was enough. Julian, caught off guard, blinked several times, unsure if what he was seeing was real. But there she was, standing just a few feet away from him. Her skin shimmered in the moonlight, a strange glow emanating from her, making her seem almost otherworldly. "Who are you?" Julian's voice broke the silence, his words filled with confusion and awe. Clyra studied him, her eyes filled with a strange hunger, but not for food. This was something new. This was a craving for connection, a longing she had never known before. "I am Clyra," she answered softly, her voice like a melody he couldn't quite understand. "I come from far away." The words felt strange on her tongue. She wasn't supposed to make contact, not with humans. Her mission was to observe, to learn, not to engage. But Julian's warmth, the warmth of his emotions, his curiosity, pulled at her, a temptation she couldn't resist. "Far away," Julian echoed, still trying to process the surreal situation. "Where are you from?" "I am not from your world," Clyra replied, her gaze never leaving his. There was a distance in her words, but there was something more, an unspoken bond between them that neither of them could explain. Julian took a cautious step forward, drawn by her presence. "I don't know if I should be afraid, or if I should." He trailed off, unsure of what he wanted to say. There was something about her that felt both alien and familiar at the same time. Clyra took a step closer, her breath quickening. The closer she got to him, the more the hunger inside her grew. It wasn't just his warmth. It was his soul, his humanity. It was everything her people had lost and could never understand. In that moment, Clyra realized that this was more than a fleeting encounter. She needed to feel more. She needed to taste the warmth of this Earthling once more. Before she could stop herself, Clyra reached out, brushing a hand against Julian's cheek. The sensation sent a shockwave through her body. It was intoxicating. His skin was warm, alive with energy. She could feel his heart beating, his emotions surging. He was real. He was here, and she craved more of him. Julian froze, eyes wide with surprise, but his body instinctively leaned into her touch. The connection was undeniable. In that moment, everything around them seemed to disappear. The stars above, the forest behind them, even the world itself. It was as if the two of them existed in a space outside time, a space where nothing mattered except the warmth they shared. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps. "I must go," she whispered, her voice filled with an unexpected sadness. The last thing she wanted was to leave him, but she knew she had to. Julian watched her, torn between confusion and a strange longing. "Wait, come back." Clara hesitated, but she didn't speak. Instead, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving Julian standing there, his heart racing, with the undeniable sense that something extraordinary had just begun. The days that followed Clara's first encounter with Julian felt like a blur. The feeling she had experienced that night, of warmth, of connection, of something deeply human, stuck with her like an aftertaste she couldn't shake off. It haunted her. No matter where she went, no matter how hard she tried to focus on her mission, all she could think about was Julian Hale. His presence, his energy, his emotions, they filled her thoughts, more vivid than anything her cold, calculated mind had ever known. Clara tried to convince herself that it was a one-time encounter, a fleeting moment of weakness that meant nothing. But the truth was undeniable. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him. She could feel his warmth. She could hear the sound of his voice, rough and uncertain, as he'd asked her, "Who are you?" His words had held so much wonder, as if he had never encountered something as strange and beautiful as her before. And maybe, just maybe, she hadn't either. The Psychtar, her people, had no use for emotions. They were creatures of logic, cold and detached from the messy, unpredictable nature of feelings. Clara had always believed that too. Until that night. Julian was a human, someone she wasn't meant to connect with, let alone crave. But now she couldn't help herself. There was something about him that went beyond her training, beyond her mission. It was as if her heart, a part of her that she had long buried, was waking up for the first time. Clara tried to bury the feelings, focusing on the data she had gathered about Earth. She told herself that she had a duty to her people, that her mission was more important than some fleeting human encounter. But the warmth of Julian's soul called to her like a siren song, drowning out the rational voice inside her head. No matter how much she tried to push him out of her mind, she couldn't forget him. Back on Earth, Julian was experiencing the same strange longing. Since the night Clara had disappeared, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't just that strange encounter with an alien woman. It was the connection, the spark, the unexplainable pull he had felt toward her. He couldn't explain it, and that only made it more intense. It wasn't just physical attraction. There was something deeper, something that went beyond words or reason, something that felt fated. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, Clara's mysterious, glowing figure, standing just beyond reach. He wondered who she really was, where she came from, and why she had vanished so quickly. Her words had been simple, but her eyes had told him something far more complex. She had been hiding something, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized he wanted to know the truth. Unable to resist the growing curiosity and desire, Julian returned to the spot where he had met her, hoping to catch a glimpse of her again. He had no idea why he felt this compulsion, but it was there, burning like a fire in his chest. Maybe he would find some answers, or maybe, just maybe, he would see her again. Clara, meanwhile, couldn't ignore the magnetic pull that brought her back to Earth. It had been weeks since she had left, but every part of her body yearned for Julian's presence. It was dangerous, this craving, but it was also more powerful than anything she had ever felt. She had never been taught to deal with emotions, to understand love or attachment. But now she was experiencing it firsthand, and it terrified her. Still, she couldn't stay away. The urge to see him again, to feel his warmth against her skin, was unbearable. She had to know if the connection was real. She had to know if the strange feelings she had were just a momentary lapse in judgment, or if something much deeper was beginning to grow between them. So, despite the warnings of her superiors and the danger of being discovered, Clara made the decision to return to Earth. She landed quietly on a secluded part of the planet, far from the eyes of both humans and Siktar alike. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved through the darkness, seeking the place where their paths had crossed before. It didn't matter if it was reckless. It didn't matter if she risked everything. She only knew one thing for certain. She needed to see Julian again. As she crept through the shadows, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was Julian. His back was turned, but she could feel the intensity of his emotions, just like before. He was waiting, as if he, too, knew that their paths were meant to cross again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, caught in the magnetic pull of each other's presence. Neither knew what the future would hold, but for now, in this moment, the only thing that mattered was the warmth between them. The moon hung high in the night sky, its silvery glow casting long shadows over the quiet landscape. Julian stood at the edge of the forest, his eyes scanning the darkness. He didn't know why he felt so drawn to this place, why his feet had brought him back here, but something told him he wasn't alone. His heart raced, as though it could sense her before he could. He hadn't seen her since that night, the mysterious woman, Clara. He didn't even know what she was, only that every part of him longed to know more. A sudden movement in the trees caught his attention. He turned, and there she was, Clara, standing in the shadows, her figure barely visible in the darkness, yet somehow brighter than the night itself. Julian's breath caught in his throat. Her presence was electric, like an unseen force that reached into him, pulling him closer to her. He didn't speak at first. What could he say? He had no words to describe the pull he felt whenever she was near. It was as if the world around him disappeared, leaving only the two of them in their own private universe. Clara stepped forward, her movements fluid and silent. She stopped just a few feet from him, her eyes meeting his. There was something different in her gaze this time, something softer, more vulnerable, yet still filled with that same intensity he had seen in her before. It was as if she had been holding back, guarding something deep inside, but now she couldn't resist the pull of whatever this connection between them was. "You came back," Julian said, his voice low and tentative, as if testing the waters. He didn't know what he expected, but he was glad to see her again. It felt like a small victory, like a thread connecting them that he couldn't sever, no matter how much he wanted to understand what was happening. "I couldn't stay away," Clara replied, her voice soft, but filled with an undeniable truth. Her words echoed in the quiet night, as though they carried more meaning than the simple sentence suggested. "There's something I can't explain, something that draws me to you." Julian's heart raced, both in confusion and longing. He couldn't explain it either, but he knew exactly what she meant. There was an undeniable bond between them, something beyond the physical attraction. It was deeper, more complex. It was as if their souls recognized each other, reaching across the divide that separated them. He had never felt anything like it before, and the idea of walking away from it was unbearable. Clara's eyes flickered to the ground for a moment, her expression shifting from one of curiosity to hesitation. "I shouldn't be here," she murmured, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "It's dangerous. For both of us." "But you're here," Julian said, stepping closer. The urge to reach out, to touch her, was overwhelming. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his heart ignored the warning. His hand hovered between them, unsure, but it didn't matter. Clara didn't pull away. Instead, she slowly reached out, her fingers grazing his skin in the gentlest of touches. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, an electric shock that neither of them could deny. Clara's breath caught, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, thick with the emotions they both tried to understand. But Julian couldn't stop himself. Without thinking, he closed the distance between them, his hand brushing her cheek. The warmth of her skin was unlike anything he had ever felt. It was as though the world was alive in that touch, pulsing, breathing with the rhythm of their hearts. Clara closed her eyes at the touch, her body trembling slightly. It was the warmth, the life in his touch that she had never experienced before. The Psychtar had no need for such things. Her people had long ago discarded these sensations in favor of logic, of control. But Julian was different. He was human, wild, unpredictable, and it was this rawness that called to her. "I don't know what this is," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to let go." Clara opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his with a mixture of sadness and longing. "I don't want to let go either," she confessed. "But I don't know how to make sense of any of this. I'm not supposed to feel this way. I shouldn't even be here. My people." "Forget them," Julian interrupted gently, taking another step closer. He didn't care about the rules or the dangers. All he knew was that in this moment, all that mattered was her. "What do you feel when you're with?" Clara swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I feel alive," she whispered. "Like I've been missing something my entire existence, and now I found it." The words hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. There was no going back. Whatever the consequences, they had crossed a line, and neither of them knew what the future held. But at that moment, all that mattered was the warmth they shared. The air between Julian and Clara had shifted. What had started as an unexplainable pull was now a force neither of them could resist. The more time they spent together, the more intense the connection became. And yet, neither of them knew what to do with it. Every meeting only deepened the confusion and longing they felt, and the walls they had once built around their hearts seemed to be crumbling faster than they could rebuild them. Clara had returned to Earth nearly every night since their first encounter, unable to stay away, even though every part of her told her to leave. It wasn't just the undeniable attraction she felt for Julian. It was something much deeper, something that tugged at her very soul. She had spent her entire life following the rigid rules of her people, the Psychtar, who valued logic and detachment above all else. But Julian had shattered that control in ways she hadn't thought possible. She had tried to convince herself that their bond was nothing more than a fleeting moment of weakness, that it wasn't real. But every time she was near him, she knew she was lying to herself. The warmth that radiated from him, the life he carried in his every movement, it was intoxicating. And every time their hands touched or their eyes met, she felt a spark, something electric, something dangerous, something she could never ignore again. Julian, too, had felt the change. Since meeting Clara, his life had been turned upside down. He had always prided himself on being in control of his emotions, on thinking logically. But now, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Every time Clara was near, it was as though his heart beat faster, his thoughts scattered, and all he wanted was to be close to her, to understand the pull that drew them together. But there were questions, so many questions, that he couldn't ignore. Who was she really? Where did she come from? And why had she disappeared after their first meeting? He had thought about those questions every day since their encounter, and yet every time he saw her again, they felt less important. What mattered now was what they shared, the warmth between them that he couldn't explain, and the unspoken bond that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. One evening, as Julian stood by the same spot in the forest where they had first met, he felt the familiar tug in his chest. He didn't even need to turn around to know she was there. He could feel her presence, like the warmth of a sunbeam breaking through the clouds. Clara stepped out from the shadows, her eyes locked on his, her expression unreadable but filled with something he couldn't name. "I didn't think you would come back," Julian said, his voice thick with longing and something else, something deeper. He couldn't deny the anticipation that built inside him at the sight of her. Every time they met, he felt as though they were crossing a line, stepping into unknown territory. But the danger, the uncertainty, only made the moments they shared feel more intense, more real. Clara hesitated for a moment, but then stepped forward, her steps silent as always. "I don't know why I keep coming back," she admitted quietly. I shouldn't. It's dangerous for both of us. I don't care about that, Julian replied quickly, taking a step toward her. I don't care about the danger. All I care about is you. The words hung in the air between them, both more vulnerable and more powerful than anything either of them had said before. Clara looked down, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never known anyone like Julian. His honesty, his willingness to risk everything for the connection they shared. It was something she wasn't used to, something she didn't know how to handle. But in that moment, standing before him, she knew she couldn't stay away any longer. The storm of emotions swirling inside her had become too strong, too overwhelming to ignore. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she placed them gently on his chest. The warmth of his skin sent a wave of comfort through her, a feeling she had never experienced before. I don't know how to control this, Clara confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Everything I've been taught tells me to stay away, to not feel this way. But when I'm with you, I can't stop it. Julian's heart skipped a beat. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. He didn't have all the answers, didn't know what the future held. But in that moment, with Clara standing before him, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't lose her. You don't have to control it, Julian said softly, his hand gently cupping her face. You don't have to fight it. Not with me. In that single moment, all the doubts, all the fears, all the rules they had been trying to follow, disappeared. There was only the warmth of their shared desire, a connection that neither of them could have predicted that both of them craved more than anything. The days following that kiss were a whirlwind of emotions for both Julian and Clara. What had once been a strange and unexplained attraction had now become something deeper, something neither of them could ignore. But as much as they wanted to stay in the moment, they both knew that they couldn't just forget the reality surrounding them. There was so much they didn't know about each other, about their worlds, and about the forces that could tear them apart. Clara had always been taught to maintain control, to keep her emotions in check. Her people, the Psychtar, valued logic and detachment above all else. But since meeting Julian, all of that had started to crumble. She had never allowed herself to feel like this before, never imagined that something as simple as a human touch could turn her world upside down. She had tried to convince herself that she was simply caught up in a moment of weakness, but with every passing day, that explanation seemed less and less believable. The warmth of Julian's presence haunted her. She found herself thinking about him at all hours of the day, remembering the feel of his hands on her skin, the sound of his voice, the way his eyes looked at her as if she were the only thing that mattered in the universe. It was intoxicating, this human connection, and it terrified her. Julian, on the other hand, was equally consumed by the events that had unfolded between them. Every moment spent with Clara felt like both a dream and a nightmare. There was something undeniably magnetic about her, something that drew him in despite the dangers. But with that attraction came a weight, the weight of the unknown. He had no idea where this connection was heading, or if it could even last. His heart told him one thing, but his mind kept asking questions he couldn't answer. What was Clara's true purpose on Earth? Who was she really, and why had she come here? One night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple, Julian found himself once again standing in the forest where they had first met. The pull to be near Clara was undeniable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. He didn't know what, but he knew he needed to see her again. As if on cue, Clara appeared, stepping out of the shadows with the same quiet grace she always had. Julian's heart raced as their eyes met. There was a heavy silence between them, an unspoken understanding that something had shifted, something had changed since their last meeting. "You've been on my mind," Julian said, his voice rough but sincere. "I can't stop thinking about you, Clara. I need to understand what's happening between us." Clara felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had been thinking about him, too, in ways she couldn't explain. The truth was, she didn't have all the answers either. She only knew that every time they were together, something inside her came alive. But the longer she stayed with him, the harder it became to ignore the dangers. She couldn't let herself get too attached. She couldn't allow herself to fall into a relationship with someone like Julian. "I don't have the answers you're looking for," she said, her voice low. "But I can't pretend like this isn't real. What we have, it's not just some passing moment, but we can't ignore the risks. You don't know who I am, Julian. You don't know what I'm here to do." Julian's brow furrowed. He had known there was more to Clara than she was telling him, but he hadn't realized how much was at stake. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't care about the risks," he said, his voice steady. "I care about you. I care about what we've shared, and I'm willing to face whatever comes our way. Together." The sincerity in his words hit Clara harder than she had expected. She had always known the power of connection, but she had never felt anything as strong or real as this before. Julian was willing to risk everything for her, for something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. And despite everything she had been taught, despite the dangers that lurked around them, she found herself yearning to do the same. "I don't know what will happen," Clara admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm afraid that whatever it is, it's not going to be easy. My people won't understand this. They won't allow it." Julian reached out, his hand gently resting on hers. "We'll figure it out, together. We don't need anyone's approval. We can make our own way." Clara's heart fluttered at his words. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly believe that they could face whatever challenges came their way. The world around them felt smaller in that moment, the weight of their worlds pressing in. But for once, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the warmth they shared, and the promise that, no matter what, they wouldn't let go. The next few days passed in a blur for both Julian and Clara. Each encounter left them both with more questions and fewer answers. Despite the attraction between them growing stronger with every moment, there was a nagging sense of unease that neither could shake. Clara could feel the weight of her mission pressing down on her, and Julian couldn't stop wondering just how far he could go without knowing the truth about her past. Clara had spent her life being taught to control her emotions, to suppress any feelings that might distract her from her purpose. But with Julian, it felt impossible. The way he looked at her, the warmth of his touch, the way his presence seemed to melt away the walls she had built around herself, it was all too much to ignore. And yet, she knew she couldn't let herself get too attached. Her mission was too important. She had come to Earth for a reason, one that had nothing to do with Julian. The Psychtar were a proud people, and their mission on Earth was one of diplomacy. Clara's presence was supposed to help ensure peace between the Psychtar and humanity, to bridge the gap between two worlds. She had been trained for this, prepared for years to follow a strict protocol, to remain impartial and neutral. But Julian had shattered that control. She couldn't explain it, couldn't understand why she felt so drawn to him, but she knew she couldn't allow herself to lose sight of the bigger picture. But how could she focus on anything else when every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face? When every time they were apart, she felt the aching emptiness of his absence. It was late one evening when Julian found Clara standing on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast ocean. The sky was streaked with shades of pink and gold as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over everything. He had come looking for her, unable to stay away any longer. "Clara," Julian called softly, approaching her cautiously. He didn't want to startle her, but he couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward her. He had to see her again, to understand why he couldn't let go. Clara turned at the sound of his voice, her eyes soft but distant. "Julian," she said, her voice heavy with unspoken words. She had been expecting him. They both knew the tension between them was building, and neither of them could keep pretending that things were simple. "What's going on, Clara?" Julian asked, his voice filled with concern. "I can see something's troubling you. You've been so distant lately." Clara looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She longed to be open with him, to tell him everything. But she couldn't. She had promised herself that she wouldn't get too close to him, that she wouldn't allow herself to be pulled into something she couldn't control. But the more time she spent with him, the harder it became to keep her distance. "I'm not who you think I am," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came here for a reason, and that reason has nothing to do with you." Julian's heart sank. He had feared this moment would come, the moment when the truth about Clara's mission would tear them apart. He had already felt the distance between them growing, but hearing the words confirmed his worst fears. "Then what is your reason, Clara?" he asked, stepping closer to her. "I don't care about your mission. I care about you. I care about what we've built together." Clara closed her eyes, fighting back the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She knew what she felt for him was real, but she couldn't allow herself to get lost in it. There were lives at stake, her people's future hanging in the balance, and no matter how much she wanted to be with Julian, no matter how much she craved his warmth and his love, she knew she couldn't allow herself to jeopardize everything for the sake of her heart. "I don't want to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "But the truth is, I don't belong here. I never did. I have responsibilities, things I can't ignore. And if I stay with you, I'll only end up dragging you into something you can't understand." Julian's heart tightened in his chest. He had never felt more conflicted in his life. On one hand, he knew Clara's mission was important, but on the other, he couldn't deny the connection between them. He had never felt anything like it before, and he wasn't ready to walk away from her. Clara turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself be with him, but she couldn't ignore the dangers that lay ahead. "I don't know if that's possible," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I'm not ready to say goodbye." And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle above, Julian knew that their journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. And whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, if Clara was willing to take that leap of faith. Clara stood at the edge of the balcony, her fingers gripping the cold metal as she gazed out into the night sky. The city lights below twinkled like stars scattered across the earth. She could hear Julian's footsteps behind her, the sound of his presence as familiar to her as the air she breathed. But tonight, things felt different. The weight of their situation pressed down on her, heavier than ever before. Julian had always been her escape, the one person who made her forget her duties, her mission, the rules she was bound by. But as the days passed, the more she realized that he was becoming her anchor, the person she couldn't live without. And that terrified her. The stakes were too high. Her people were depending on her, and if she let herself be drawn into this relationship with him, everything she had worked for would be at risk. "You've been distant again," Julian said, his voice soft but filled with concern. He had grown used to her silence, to the moments when her thoughts seemed to drift far from him. But tonight, it felt like something was breaking inside her, something she couldn't keep hidden anymore. Clara turned to face him, her eyes tired but determined. She had always been able to keep her emotions in check, but the truth was, she was scared. She didn't know how much longer she could pretend that everything was fine, that she could keep her mission and her heart separated. The two had become tangled together, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't pull them apart. "I've been thinking," Clara began, her voice shaky, "about us, about everything. And I've come to a realization. I can't keep doing this, Julian. I can't keep pretending that we can just have this connection and ignore the rest of the world." Julian's heart sank at her words. He knew what she was saying, but hearing her say it aloud made it feel so much more real. She was pulling away from him, retreating into the safety of her mission. "I don't want to pretend anymore, Clara," Julian replied, his voice full of emotion. "I don't want to ignore what's happening between us. You've changed everything for me. You've made me realize that I'm willing to face whatever comes, even if it means risking everything. I'm ready to stand by you, no matter what. We don't have to choose between what we want and what's expected of us. We can have both. Clyra closed her eyes, her chest tightening at his words. She wanted to believe him, to believe that they could have both the life they wanted and the duty that weighed on her. But deep down, she knew that the consequences of choosing Julian would be far more dangerous than she was willing to risk. "You don't understand, Julian," Clyra said, her voice breaking. "My people don't see things the way you do. They don't see us. If they find out what's happening between us, it could destroy everything. The peace we've worked for, the balance we've built, it could all collapse. And I can't let that happen." Julian stepped closer to her, his hand gently reaching out to touch hers. "What if I told you that I'm willing to fight for us? That I'm ready to face whatever challenges come our way? You don't have to do this alone, Clyra. We're in this together." Clyra felt his warmth spread through her, and for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she didn't have to choose, where the connection between them was enough to overcome all the barriers they faced. But then the harsh reality of her situation hit her again. She wasn't just a woman in love. She was a representative of her people, a diplomat sent to Earth to ensure peace. Her choices were never hers alone. They affected millions of lives. "I want to believe that, Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But the truth is, I can't risk your life. I can't risk everything for a love that might not even survive the truth." A silence hung between them, the weight of her words settling heavily in the air. Julian's heart ached as he realized just how much she was sacrificing. But even in the face of her fears, he couldn't give up on her. He couldn't walk away from the person who had become everything to him. "I'm not afraid of the truth," he said firmly, his eyes locking with hers. "I'm afraid of losing you. And if that means facing whatever comes, then so be it. I'd rather have you by my side, no matter what the cost." Clyra felt her resolve waver at his words uncertain, and the dangers they faced were very real. But one thing was clear to her now. No matter how much she tried to resist, she couldn't ignore the love that had taken root in her heart. Julian's face softened, relief flooding his chest. He reached for her, pulling her into an embrace that felt like a promise, one that neither of them could make alone, but one that they would face together, no matter the cost. The decision had been made, but neither Julian nor Clyra knew exactly where it would lead. It was one thing to admit that they wanted to be together, but another to understand the full weight of what that would mean. Clyra had spent so many years keeping her emotions locked away, but now, the feelings she had tried so hard to suppress were rushing to the surface. She wasn't just an alien diplomat. She was a woman who had fallen in love with a man who didn't understand the dangers that came with being with her, and she feared that love would be the very thing that destroyed them both. As the days passed, they found themselves caught between two worlds, the world Clyra had come from, and the world she had grown to love. The reality of her position weighed heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't just walk away from the life she had known, from her responsibilities to her people. Her duty had always come first. But now, with Julian in her life, everything had shifted. She was no longer sure where her duty ended and where her heart began. One evening, after a tense meeting with the leaders of the Siktar delegation, Clyra returned to her private quarters. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a single lamp that cast soft shadows across the walls. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to gather her thoughts. The weight of her decision felt heavier now than ever before. She had chosen Julian, chosen to embrace what they had together, no matter the risks. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking straight into the unknown. The door to her room opened, and Julian stepped inside. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with the unspoken emotions that they both tried to keep at bay. But now, it was clear that neither could pretend anymore. "You're still worried, aren't you?" Julian asked softly, his voice filled with understanding. Clyra looked up at him, her heart aching at the sight of him. He had always been there for her, always ready to stand by her side, no matter what. But she couldn't let him walk into this blind. The danger was real. The consequences of their love could be catastrophic, not just for them, but for everyone they cared about. "I don't want to drag you into this, Julian," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what it means for me to be with you. The risks, the consequences. If the Siktar find out about us, it could ruin everything. And if it comes down to a choice between you and my people, I don't know what I'll do." Julian crossed the room and knelt in front of her, his hand gently resting on hers. "You don't have to choose, Clara. I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between me and your mission. What we have is real, and I believe we can make it work. I'll fight for you. I'll fight for us." Clara's eyes filled with tears at his words. She wanted so badly to believe him, to think that love could conquer all the challenges they faced. But the reality was more complicated. The Siktar were not known for their forgiveness, and the Earth governments were already suspicious of her presence. She couldn't afford to risk everything for something that might never be accepted. But the truth was, she couldn't imagine her life without Julian. He had become more than just a man she was drawn to. He was her partner, her equal. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to bridge the gap between their two worlds. "I don't know if we can survive this," Clara said, her voice breaking. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to take that leap, with you." Julian smiled, relief washing over him as he pulled her into a gentle embrace. "Then let's take that leap together." In that moment, something shifted between them. The uncertainty, the fear, the danger, they all seemed to melt away, replaced by a shared resolve. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Julian by her side. And no matter what happened next, she knew they would face it together. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Clara and Julian had crossed a line. There was no going back now. They had chosen each other, and now they would have to fight for their love, for their future, and for a chance at happiness in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. But together, they were stronger. Together, they could face anything. Clara and Julian stood side by side at the heart of the Siktar embassy, the tension between them palpable. It was a day they both knew would come eventually, but neither of them was truly prepared for it. Today, Clara would have to face the leaders of her people, the Siktar Council, and reveal the truth about her relationship with Julian. She had spent years keeping her emotions under control, hiding everything for the sake of peace. But now, there was no turning back. Julian was with her, and their love could no longer be hidden. The doors to the council chamber opened with a low hum, and Clara stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was vast, with high ceilings and sharp angles that seemed to echo her fear. The Siktar Council members sat in a semicircle before her, their piercing gazes focused on her every move. They were the ones who had sent her to Earth, the ones who had trusted her with such an important mission. But now, they would learn the truth about her heart, and she wasn't sure they would approve. Julian stood behind her, his presence a comforting weight. He knew how much this moment meant to her, how much it could change their futures. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. Together, they would take the consequences, whatever they might be. Clara cleared her throat and stepped forward. "Esteemed members of the Siktar Council, I have come to you today with a matter of great importance, a matter that cannot be ignored any longer." Her voice rang out with strength, though it trembled slightly with the weight of the words she was about to say. The council members exchanged quiet glances, their expressions unreadable. Clara could feel their eyes on her, weighing her every word. She had to be careful. One wrong move, and she could risk not only her career, but also the fragile peace she had worked so hard to build between their worlds. "I have been keeping a secret," Clara continued, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "A secret that involves the Earthling you know as Julian. We have formed a bond, a connection that goes beyond diplomacy, beyond our mission. We are in love." The words hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. Clara could hear her heart thundering in her chest, but she refused to look away from the council. This was the moment where everything would change. There was a long silence. The council members exchanged sharp whispers, their voices too low for Clara to understand. She could feel the room shift, the weight of judgment settling on her. She had expected this. She had expected the disapproval, the anger. The Sectar were not a race known for their flexibility, especially when it came to matters of diplomacy and loyalty. Finally, a voice spoke from the center of the council. It was Varkle, the eldest and most powerful member of the council. His voice was like ice as he addressed Clara. "Your actions are unexpected, Clara," Varkle said, his words measured and cold. "You were chosen for this mission because of your loyalty to our people. To see you abandon that for the sake of an Earthling. It's not just about him." Clara interrupted, her voice firm, though her heart raced. "It's about what we can accomplish together. Our two worlds can unite in a way that benefits both of us. But that can only happen if we trust each other, if we embrace what is possible instead of clinging to old prejudices." There was a murmur of surprise from the council members, but Clara stood her ground. She wasn't going to back down now. She couldn't. Varkle's gaze softened, just slightly, and Clara could see the conflict in his eyes. "You speak of unity, but you put our entire mission at risk. The Earthlings are unpredictable. Their motives are unclear. They may be unpredictable." Julian spoke up, his voice calm but unwavering. "But that's part of their strength. They don't rely on rules alone. They rely on creativity, adaptability. It's what makes them dangerous and beautiful." There was a moment of silence as the council processed Julian's words. Clara held her breath, waiting for the judgment she feared. Would they agree with her? Or would this be the end of everything? Finally, Varkle stood, his voice low but resolute. "Perhaps there is more to Earthlings than we have realized. Your bond is unorthodox, Clara, but it may also be the key to something greater. However, the choice is not ours alone. It will be up to the people of Siktar to decide the future of your relationship. We will put it to a vote." Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the fate of everything she had worked for. Her relationship with Julian, the future of their people, was now in the hands of the Siktar. But in that moment, Clara realized something important. She had already made her choice. She had chosen Julian, and no matter what the council decided, she would stand by him.